The year is 1064. Beneath the scorching sun of Jerusalem's desert sands, a tale beyond reason and imagination was about to be carved in blood. 800 battle-hardened men from the distant north, Viking warriors who had been tested in countless wars, were preparing to stand against an enemy nearly 40 times their number. What unfolded that day would alter forever the perception of military might in the Holy Land, revealing that in certain moments, faith itself could become the deadliest weapon ever wielded. Yet before I take you deep into the most chilling details of this massacre, I must ask something of you. If this story has already gripped your attention as fiercely as it seized mine when I first uncovered it, then show it now by pressing that like button, because I assure you what lies ahead will dismantle every expectation you hold about what religious devotion, when fused with fanaticism, can achieve upon the battlefield. Our journey does not begin beneath the desert sun, but far away, along the mist-wrapped shores of Norway, there reigned King Magnus III, better remembered as Magnus Barefoot, a title earned from his peculiar habit of wearing traditional Scottish garb rather than the typical robes of royalty. By this era, Christianity had indeed spread throughout Scandinavia, yet it had not extinguished the burning Viking spirit. Instead, the two fused into something far more volatile, far more dangerous: holy warriors. Magnus listened intently to the summons of Pope Alexander II, who called upon the faithful to rise and defend Christianity's sacred places. But unlike many European nobles who regarded the Crusades merely as convenient avenues for political gain and expansion, Magnus envisioned something entirely different. He saw in them the chance to fuse the brutal ferocity of Viking blood with the righteous flame of divine sanction. His warriors would not march toward the Holy Land as ordinary conquerors seeking riches. No, he intended them to go as living instruments of God's will. The process of recruitment was ruthless, merciless, and exacting. Magnus had no desire for common soldiers or inexperienced men. He demanded only the strongest, the most seasoned, the very elite. He gathered veterans who had survived the endless wars between rival Nordic kingdoms, men who had proven themselves not once, but dozens of times in the chaos of battle. Each of the 800 selected was required to demonstrate three things beyond question: mastery of axe and sword, almost superhuman endurance, and of all, an unbreakable, unwavering faith in their holy mission. For months these chosen warriors submitted themselves to relentless preparation. They trained through day and night, forging their strength through ancient Viking combat methods, while also adopting advanced strategies borrowed from Byzantine mercenaries. For perhaps the first time in their warrior culture, they learned to fight not as scattered berserkers, but as one unified machine. They practiced defensive formations drilled in perfectly timed, coordinated strikes, and most critically, trained themselves to remain steadfast under suffocating pressure. But this was only half of their transformation. King Magnus understood that steel and muscle alone could not forge the type of force he envisioned, and so he summoned monks, warrior priests, and military chaplains to mold the inner lives of his soldiers. Their bodies would be trained for war, but their spirits had to be sanctified for holy battle. Each day began with prayer, and each night closed with hymns. Every meal was consecrated. Every weapon was blessed and set apart as sacred. These men were no longer merely soldiers. They were transforming into zealots, religious fanatics, carrying within them the devastating fury of berserkers. In the spring of 1064, the Viking fleet pushed out of Bergen's harbors, sails filled with the northern winds, but Magnus never intended to steer directly for the Holy Land. His strategy was patient and calculated. He would sharpen his warriors by gathering strength, allies, and combat experience along the journey. Their first destination was the Orkney Islands, where Magnus recruited hardened local mercenaries accustomed to harsher climates and seasoned in battles beyond their northern homeland. With fresh reinforcements swelling their ranks, the fleet then turned southward, steering into unfamiliar waters until they reached the coasts of Spain. Here, the Vikings found themselves drawn into skirmishes with Muslim forces, testing their ferocity against a completely different kind of adversary. Every clash became a lesson. They quickly realized that these new foes bore little resemblance to the Saxons or Danes they had crushed back home. The Saracen warriors were nimble horsemen, lethal with bow and arrow, and clever in battlefield maneuvering, yet the Vikings uncovered a truth that gave them confidence. While their enemies excelled in strategy and skill, they had no answer for the terrifying, almost suicidal ferocity born of combining the ruthless Viking spirit with holy devotion. The fusion of ancient bloodlust and sacred cause made these northern warriors something their opponents had never seen before. By the time winter descended, the fleet had pressed onward and reached Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. There, Magnus solidified alliances with the Byzantines, who recognized the potential of his fanatic warriors. In exchange for loyalty and service, the Vikings received access to advanced weapons, finely crafted armor, and crucial knowledge of Mediterranean warfare. Their transformation into holy avengers was nearly complete. When the next spring arrived, the long-awaited turn toward Jerusalem was made. By then, word of their march had already spread throughout the Muslim world, echoing across the deserts and cities. Still, the Saracen commanders remained unshakable. To them, 800 men were laughable when measured against the vast forces guarding the sacred city. Among these commanders was Elamir Abu Nasr Shams al-Muluk, the formidable leader of Muslim forces in the Jerusalem region. He saw the arrival of Magnus's Vikings not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Crushing them would be a chance to demonstrate his might, humiliate these northern invaders, and send a clear warning to all future Christian crusaders. With confidence bordering on arrogance, he summoned an army of staggering scale, 40,000 men, heavy cavalry, mounted archers, lines of hardened infantry, even siege engines, all assembled under his command. To him, this was not a battle waiting to unfold. It was a foregone conclusion, an execution masquerading as war. The two forces at last converged on the arid plains southeast of Jerusalem, in the shadow of the ancient fortress of Herodion. The contrast between the two armies was breathtaking, almost surreal. On one side, the horizon rippled with endless waves of the Saracen host, banners snapping violently in the desert wind, the ground trembling beneath the relentless thunder of hooves and marching feet. Their war cries and the rhythmic clash of arms blended into a roar that filled the air. On the other side, compact and immovable, stood the small square of 800 Vikings. Their polished shields reflected the merciless Middle Eastern sun, their axes gripped tightly, their formation silent, yet unbroken. They waited, calm and unflinching, like a wall of iron forged by faith and fury. Abu Nasr had no doubts about his strategy. It was a method he had used time and time again, and it had never failed. His cavalry would sweep wide to encircle the enemy entirely. Archers would rain volleys of arrows to wear them down, shattering their defense and breaking their morale. Then, when the Vikings were weakened, his infantry would surge forward to finish the job. Against countless armies before, this had been an unshakable, flawless tactic. Abu Nasr had no reason to suspect that this day would end any differently than countless others. His tactics had never failed him, and his overwhelming numbers promised an easy victory. But what he could not know was that Magnus and his commanders had anticipated this exact plan. During those long months of grueling preparation, they had studied the methods of Saracen warfare with relentless focus, dissecting every tactic, every maneuver. From that study, they forged a counter-strategy, one that amplified Viking strengths while exploiting Muslim vulnerabilities. What Abu Nasr did not realize was that these 800 warriors were not planning to survive this day. They were planning to die as martyrs, unleashing destruction in the most catastrophic and calculated way possible. At dawn, the desert floor quivered under the deep, mournful bellow of Saracen war horns. The ground shook as thousands of cavalry surged forward, scimitars gleaming beneath the rising sun, their charge like a tidal wave of steel and horseflesh. Yet instead of locking shields and bracing for impact, the Vikings did something completely unthinkable. They split apart. Now you might ask yourself, how could a mere 800 even dream of standing against 40,000? The answer was not brute force. It lay in something far more subtle, far more devastating, the psychology of war. And in this dark art, the Vikings were unmatched. They knew a truth their enemies had yet to understand. Terror could outweigh numbers, and panic could destroy an army faster than steel. But before I reveal the precise instant when this battle was turned upside down, I must ask you help me spread this incredible story. Share it now, because what comes next will overturn everything you thought you knew about the ways medieval warfare was fought. The 800 Vikings divided into 8 units, each composed of 100 men. This was no retreat, no desperate scramble for survival. It was the deliberate execution of a deadly tactic they had perfected in their training, the Wheel of Death. Each unit formed a tight defensive circle, their shields locked, their weapons raised, arranged in such a way that the spaces between these circles created carefully calculated killing zones. When the Saracen cavalry charged, expecting to smash through a solid defensive wall, they instead plunged into chaos. The riders galloped between the Viking circles, only to find the gaps closing behind them, trapping horse and man alike in confined pockets of death. Confusion spread like wildfire. The cavalry found themselves cut apart, hemmed in, and struck simultaneously from every side. The first wave of riders who blundered into this nightmare experienced something beyond anything they had ever witnessed. The Vikings fought with more than brute savagery. They fought with a chilling, perfect coordination. Every strike flowed seamlessly into another. Every block transitioned into a counterblow. Their movements looked less like men fighting independently and more like a single organism, guided by one mind. But what horrified the Saracens most was not this mastery of tactics, it was the Vikings' utter indifference to pain and death. These warriors had entered what their forefathers had once called the berserker gang, a trance of unstoppable battle frenzy. Yet this was no ordinary rage. It had been amplified, supercharged by unshakable religious conviction. They were not merely berserkers, they were holy berserkers. Believers who fought with the certainty that each enemy cut down guaranteed them a place in paradise. From his vantage point atop a ridge, Abu Nasser observed the chaos with a mixture of irritation and disbelief. At first he felt no real concern. Perhaps 1,000 men had been lost in the opening clash, but against the immensity of his army, such casualties were trivial. With cool confidence, he issued his next command. This time the mounted archers would take the field, keeping their distance while loosing wave after wave of arrows into the Viking circles. But once again, the Norsemen had prepared for this exact assault. During the night before the clash, each Viking unit had worked tirelessly, fashioning makeshift fortifications out of whatever they could salvage. They used the shields of fallen foes, broken spears, fragments of armor, and even the bodies of the dead to construct crude barricades. By dawn, these improvised walls stood ready, transforming each defensive circle into a miniature fortress. So when the storm of arrows came screaming down from the sky, the Norsemen did not scatter or panic. They crouched in disciplined silence behind their shield walls, letting the missiles rattle harmlessly against their defenses, biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. What followed was something that Muslim chroniclers of the age would later record with horror, describing it as a fleeting vision of hell itself, unleashed upon the desert sands. The Vikings did not remain caged behind their defenses. They exploded outward in counterattacks that introduced weapons their enemies had never even conceived of. They wielded monstrous war axes, their blades forged with jagged edges designed to tear through steel and splinter armor. They carried long spears tipped with cruel hooks, ideal for snagging mounted riders and yanking them screaming from their horses, dragging them into the maelstrom of blades. But the most dreadful weapon of all was one they had obtained during their winter in Constantinople. Among their spoils was a mysterious flammable substance, terrifyingly similar to the Byzantine Greek fire. Contained in jars and flasks, this liquid clung to whatever it touched, igniting in an inferno that could not be quenched by sand or water. When the Vikings hurled it upon the charging cavalry, the desert lit up with burning horses and screaming men, their armor melting as if the very fires of hell had swallowed them whole. The second Saracen assault disintegrated into a massacre. Mounted archers, who were accustomed to enemies fleeing before their overwhelming volleys, now found themselves paralyzed with disbelief. Instead of breaking, these northerners pressed forward with greater fury every time one of their own fell. It seemed as though the more Vikings died, the stronger the survivors became. And when one of them was struck mortally, he did not retreat or cry out in despair. Instead, with his last ounce of strength, he hurled himself into the fray, dragging down 2, 3, even 4 enemies before collapsing in death. From his vantage point, Abu Nasr felt the first tremors of dread. He had thought he was fighting an army. Now, watching the chaos unfold, he began to understand the terrible truth. These were not mere soldiers. These were men who fought as if they had already crossed into death, warriors for whom fear of mortality no longer existed. They did not fight to live. They fought because death itself was their aim, their victory, their gateway to paradise. Shaken by the mounting casualties, Abu Nasr abandoned his calculated, cautious approach. Precision and strategy had failed. Archers could not shatter the Viking resolve. If these men refused to yield, then he would drown them in numbers. Sheer, overwhelming force would achieve what tactics could not. And so, with grim determination, he gave the order to unleash the full weight of his infantry. 20,000 men would now be hurled directly at the 800. Under the merciless blaze of the midday sun, the desert erupted once more. Tens of thousands of Saracen infantry poured forward in every direction, surrounding the Vikings in an unending tide of bodies. Their plan was brutally simple: to smother the northerners under a flood of steel and flesh, to crush them by sheer mass, 25 men against each one. Against such odds, no warrior alive could possibly endure. But what Abu Nasr did not realize was that the Vikings had been preparing for this exact moment. During their winter in Constantinople, they had not only secured superior armor and Byzantine-forged weapons, they had also uncovered and perfected the darkest secret of all, the Byzantine Greek fire. And with it, they had created a variant of their own, an infernal weapon that would turn the battlefield into a furnace. Each Viking circle had hidden reserves of this deadly substance, waiting with ruthless patience for the instant their enemies pressed close enough to be consumed. When the Saracen infantry advanced to within 50 meters, the command was given. Suddenly, hundreds of incendiary projectiles were hurled into the sky, their fiery arcs cutting across the blinding heat of the desert sun. A heartbeat later, the battlefield erupted. Rings of fire exploded around each Viking position, encircling them not as a trap, but as a weapon unleashed with surgical precision. This was no ordinary fire. It clung to skin, to cloth, to steel. It spread along armor plates and chainmail like liquid flame. Water could not extinguish it. Every attempt only seemed to feed the blaze. And with each gust of the desert wind, the inferno swelled higher and hotter, devouring everything in its path. The effect on the Saracen lines was instantaneous. Panic ripped through the ranks like a shockwave. Soldiers who had marched moments earlier with confidence and discipline suddenly found themselves engulfed in horror. Columns broke apart as men shrieked, tearing off burning armor that melted into their flesh. The battlefield resounded with the screams of the dying, mingling with the clash of steel and the deep guttural war cries of the Norsemen. Seizing the moment, the Vikings abandoned their fortified circles. They charged outward, bursting through walls of fire and bodies, surging into the chaos with a ferocity that defied reason. This was no longer battle as the Saracens understood it. This was something older, rawer, more terrifying, violence stripped to its core, infused with the holy certainty of martyrdom. Imagine it. 800 men, many bleeding from their wounds, some running ablaze from their own unleashed fire, sprinting headlong across a battlefield turned into hell. They roared ancient prayers in Old Norse, their voices echoing like thunder as they tore into enemies who outnumbered them dozens to one. It was a vision so surreal, so unnatural, that it shattered the courage of even seasoned veterans. Entire units dissolved, scattering in terror. From his vantage point, Abu Nasr watched in horror as his carefully constructed army began to disintegrate. His disciplined host of 40,000 was unraveling into chaos, undone by a mere 800 zealots. Desperation overcame him. If numbers, if fire, if arrows could not break these madmen, then perhaps the death of their king would cut off the head, and the body must die. He summoned his personal guard, 2,000 of the finest warriors under his command, veterans of 100 campaigns, feared across the region, men who had battled Crusaders, Byzantines and Seljuks, and had never once tasted defeat. They were legends, the iron spine of his power. Their mission was clear and simple: cut down Magnus himself, and with his fall, shatter the spirit of the Vikings. But when they hurled themselves into the fray against Magnus and his chosen elite, they quickly realized this was no ordinary foe. Magnus stood like a figure from myth, towering above his men over 2 meters in height. He wielded a double-headed axe of massive size, said to have been blessed by the Pope himself before the journey began. On the battlefield, he was not merely a man, he was a symbol, a living incarnation of both Viking ferocity and Christian zeal. His presence alone ignited his men into frenzy, while striking terror deep into the hearts of his enemies. What followed was a battle within the battle, a clash set apart from the larger carnage. The finest warriors of the Saracen world collided with the fiercest sons of the north in a storm of steel, fire and blood. For a full hour, the outcome trembled in the balance. The Saracen guard fought with the desperation of men who knew the survival of their entire army depended on their blades. The Vikings fought with the unyielding conviction that God himself had ordained their victory. It was not merely a contest of strength, but a collision of 2 worlds, 2 visions of war, 2 faiths that would never reconcile. At last, amid the screaming and the slaughter, the moment came. Magnus and Abu Nasr, king and commander, titan and general, found themselves face to face, locked in single combat. Abu Nasr was no ordinary commander. He had been molded in the renowned schools of Damascus, where the art of the sword was elevated to near perfection. He had fought in countless duels, his blade sharpened not only by steel but also by discipline and experience. His movements were precise, his strikes deliberate, his reputation undeniable. Yet when he faced Magnus, he found himself against something that could not be measured by training alone. Magnus was not simply a warrior. He was the embodiment of Viking ferocity fused with European martial discipline, a man whose every blow seemed powered by a faith so unshakable that it rendered skill almost meaningless. To Magnus, the swing of his colossal axe was not his own doing, but the hand of divine providence, carving its will into the world. The duel between the 2 men lasted only minutes, though to the soldiers watching it seemed an eternity. Abu Nasr fought with courage, his blade flashing with practiced elegance, but conviction proved more enduring than technique. Magnus's fury, guided by the belief that God had chosen him, was inexhaustible. Finally, the great axe fell true. The strike cut not only through Abu Nasr, but through the very spirit of his army. The death of their commander was more than a personal defeat. It was the shattering of a collective will. The Saurus host, once an unbreakable wall of steel and faith, suddenly stood hollow. In that moment, disbelief spread like poison. Could it truly be that these 800 northerners, fanatics who fought as if death were their triumph, were unstoppable? The thought slithered through the ranks, eroding certainty, birthing dread. Confidence that had seemed immovable only hours before dissolved into fear, and fear spread faster than any fire. But the tale darkens further. Many would assume the fall of Abu Nazar to be the climax, the breaking point after which the battle was decided. Yet this was not the end. What came next defied every principle of medieval warfare. With their leaders slain and their finest warriors lying dead upon the sand, the Surus army should have done the rational thing: retreat, regroup, or surrender. That was what logic dictated. But war is not ruled by logic. Mass psychology is a beast of its own, and when panic takes root, it consumes all reason. In an instant, order collapsed. 40,000 men turned into a stampede of terror. Soldiers trampled comrades in blind desperation, throwing down shields and weapons in their mad rush to escape the spectre of northern demons who fought with no regard for their own lives. Officers screamed for order, raising banners trying to rally the scattered host. Their cries were silenced either by the chaos or by their own men's blades, for discipline had dissolved into madness. From his position amidst the carnage, Magnus watched the rout unfold. His eyes burned with something more terrifying than rage: conviction. He raised his voice above the din and gave a chilling command: no survivors. This was not spoken as strategy. It was pronounced as judgment. It was not about winning a battle anymore. It was about extermination, sanctified by the belief that God himself had delivered these enemies into their hands for cleansing. What followed was no mere pursuit. It was annihilation stretched across 3 days. The Vikings transformed the desert into a hunting ground, their months of preparation now revealing their full purpose. They cut off escape routes with precision, laying ambushes where the fleeing soldiers least expected them. They cornered stragglers in dry ravines and slaughtered them beneath the burning sun. But this was not just war. It had become ritual. Every kill was performed as though it were an offering. Captured enemies were executed with solemn prayers, their deaths consecrated as holy acts, their blood a grim sacrifice to the divine. On the first day, 10,000 Saracens fell beneath axe and blade. On the second, 15,000 more were cut down, their cries echoing across the wasteland. By the third day, the desert was littered with corpses, and only scattered remnants remained. Broken men crawling through sand, shadows of an army that had begun the battle with the arrogance of superiority. Now they were phantoms fleeing for survival against an enemy who did not simply fight to live, but fought to sanctify death itself. The Vikings, having drenched the sands in blood and convinced themselves that their divine mission had been completed, finally drew their relentless pursuit to a halt. The desert winds carried the stench of death, as silence replaced the screams, and only then did the full scale of the massacre become clear. More than 35,000 Saracen soldiers lay dead across the dunes, their bodies blackened by fire or broken by steel. Of the 800 Norse warriors who had marched boldly into the unforgiving desert, only 230 had fallen. Their losses were grievous, but when weighed against the impossible odds they had faced, it was nothing short of miraculous. Yet the true magnitude of the battle's outcome stretched far beyond the blood-soaked sands. Word of the slaughter spread across the Muslim world like a raging wildfire, impossible to contain. From Damascus to Baghdad, from Cairo to Aleppo, whispers turned into panic. The notion that a tiny band of Christian warriors, foreigners hardened by northern winters, had annihilated one of the region's most formidable armies was incomprehensible. Fear settled into the hearts of rulers and generals alike. For the first time in generations, Muslim leaders began to contemplate a possibility they had long dismissed: that Jerusalem, long held securely, might once again fall into Christian hands. Magnus and his surviving warriors wasted no time in seizing this newfound aura of invincibility. They became living legends overnight, their scars and battered armor serving as proof of God's supposed favor. Local Christian communities, who for decades had endured subjugation under Muslim rule, now rallied eagerly to their banner, their faith rekindled by what seemed to be a miracle. Peasants, deserters, and militias swelled Magnus's ranks, until within weeks his force had grown from a few hundred battered survivors to over 3,000 men, each one burning with fanatical devotion to the holy cause of reconquest. But this was no campaign of orderly conquest. What followed was a campaign of terror, psychological as much as military. Every skirmish, no matter how minor, was retold as though it were the intervention of heaven itself. Propaganda elevated the Vikings into supernatural figures, warriors beyond mortal comprehension, chosen by God to cleanse the Holy Land. Cities capitulated without resistance at the faintest rumor of their approach. Entire garrisons abandoned their posts, unwilling to face the northern demons who fought as if death were victory itself. Even hardened Saris commanders, men who had survived a lifetime of campaigns against Crusaders, Byzantines, and Turks, refused to march against Magnus, fearing that to meet him in open battle was to march willingly into damnation. In this way, Magnus's reputation itself became the deadliest weapon in his arsenal, more terrifying than any axe, sword, or fire. His presence turned rumor into panic, panic into surrender, and surrender into conquest. Yet the tale does not conclude in those sands. Its true weight would not be felt until decades later, when the spark of the Crusades ignited across Europe. The massacre at Jerusalem was not simply remembered as a victory, it was immortalized as legend. The sheer brutality of it, the impossible imbalance of numbers, the shocking vision of 800 northern warriors annihilating 40,000 foes, these were details that seared themselves into the collective imagination of Christendom. When the news crossed the seas and reached the courts of Europe, it could not have come at a more pivotal time. Pope Urban II was preparing his call to arms, rallying Christendom for what would become the First Crusade. The story of Magnus Barefoot and his indomitable Norsemen became the ultimate proof, a divine omen made flesh that God himself favored Christian arms. Chroniclers, eager to inspire zeal, exaggerated the account until it resembled myth more than memory. Songs, sermons, and tales spread the vision of Viking martyrs turned saints, whose courage had broken an army 50 times their size. And thus, what began as a desert massacre grew into something far greater, a story that would echo through generations, shaping not only the history of Jerusalem, but the destiny of Europe itself. Chroniclers across Christendom began to whisper that angels themselves had fought beside the Norsemen in the sands of Jerusalem. Tales spread that their weapons were touched by miracles, that their armor had been consecrated by heaven so no arrow could pierce it. Whether every rumor was believed in its entirety mattered little. The psychological impact was undeniable. To thousands of nobles and knights who heard of this northern miracle, the message was clear: if such a small host could triumph so completely, then surely divine victory was assured for any man who took the cross. Yet the legacy of Magnus's slaughter bore darker fruit. His campaign became more than a victory, it became a precedent. The massacre provided a justification for unrestrained brutality in the name of God. From that moment onward, the idea that holy war allowed the complete annihilation of one's enemies seeped into the fabric of Crusader ideology. The methods pioneered by those 800 Vikings, the use of terror as a weapon, the unleashing of incendiary fire upon helpless foes, the ritualized execution of prisoners, and the relentless pursuit of fleeing armies were copied again and again by the Christian hosts that followed. What had begun as a singular, almost mythic expedition grew into a blueprint for centuries of religious war. Magnus himself did not live to witness the vast shadow cast by his deeds. In 1069, near the city of Antioch, he fell in battle against Turkish warriors, his colossal frame at last brought down by steel. Yet his death only elevated his story. Ballads and epic songs glorified his name across Europe, sung in long halls where firelight flickered against timbered ceilings. Churches were dedicated in his memory, sanctifying him in stone and glass. His name was invoked by warriors before battle, as if calling upon Magnus himself might summon divine favor. The handful of Vikings who returned home to Scandinavia were hailed not merely as men, but as living legends. They bore scars as proof of miracles, and their accounts of Jerusalem ignited a fire in the young. Their stories fanned the flames of crusading zeal, inspiring a new generation of Norsemen to march east beneath the banner of Christ. This model that small, elite bands of religious fanatics could shatter armies many times their size was replicated again and again. In time, orders like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers embodied the same spirit, fusing unshakable faith with martial discipline, blending ritual devotion with ruthless efficiency. Their entire ethos traced its lineage back to the Desert Massacre, to those 800 Norsemen who believed death itself was victory. And yet, perhaps the most striking lesson left by that slaughter was not found in tactics or weapons, but in conviction itself. The Vikings did not triumph because of numbers. They were dwarfed by the tens of thousands arrayed against them. Nor was it purely because of superior steel, clever fortifications, or Byzantine secrets. Though these mattered, they prevailed because they were utterly transformed by belief. Convinced beyond doubt that they were chosen by God, they fought as men already dead, wielding faith like a weapon sharper than any axe. In the scorching heat of the desert, with bodies broken and blood spilling freely, they endured because each wound was a holy trial, each moment of agony a step closer to paradise. That belief unleashed a ferocity no ordinary army could match, a force that turned mortals into something more than human. The massacre of Jerusalem, therefore, revealed something fundamental about the nature of medieval war. That faith, whether grounded in truth, illusion, or myth, could become the most devastating weapon of all. Numbers alone never determined the outcome of great battles. Morale, conviction, and psychological dominance often carried more weight than sheer numbers. A smaller, tightly unified force, fanatically devoted to its cause, could topple a massive army if it managed to shatter the enemy's spirit. Commanders across Christendom recognized this truth. In the decades that followed, many sought to emulate the Viking approach, forming their own elite, faith-driven units. Some of these efforts achieved astonishing success, others ended in catastrophic failure. Yet the core lesson endured through time. A soldier's belief could prove more lethal than the blade he carried. Propaganda amplified this effect. Once the Vikings carved out a reputation for being unbeatable, that very image became another weapon. Enemies surrendered without a fight. Allies rallied eagerly to their side. Entire campaigns were not only fought with steel, but also won with stories. Seen from today's perspective, the massacre stands as both awe-inspiring and horrifying. It demonstrates the extremes of human capacity when fueled by unwavering conviction. At the same time, it illustrates how quickly such power can turn toward atrocity. The very fanaticism that allowed 800 men to annihilate 40,000 is the same brand of fanaticism that later fueled history's darkest crimes. The problem does not lie in the intensity of belief itself, but in the morality of the cause that belief serves. Magnus and his warriors were convinced they fought for God's will. Their enemies, however, regarded them as demons unleashed upon the desert sands. Both perspectives held a measure of truth. What cannot be denied is that their actions were extraordinary, an extreme display of what humans are capable of, whether for good or for evil, when united under a cause greater than themselves. The massacre left deep scars in the Muslim world as well. For generations, the memory of those northern fanatics haunted rulers and commanders. Even as their armies were rebuilt, the legend of the Vikings lingered like a threatening shadow. The very thought that Christians could summon such terrifying zeal made every future battle feel uncertain. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the tale became one of triumph. It fueled the momentum that would ignite the First Crusade. It emboldened warriors, terrified their adversaries, and reshaped the very rules of holy war. Magnus Barefoot transcended the role of king. He had become a symbol, a living reminder of what absolute faith could unleash. Even 1,000 years later, the story of his 800 warriors continues to resonate, echoing as a lesson across the centuries. They remind us that the boundaries of human potential are not always physical, but often mental. At times, the only true divide between triumph and failure lies in what people believe is achievable. Consider it carefully. How many moments in your own life have slipped away because you convinced yourself something was impossible before you ever dared to try? The warriors of Magnus reveal that impossibility is frequently nothing more than an illusion of the mind. Their tale serves as both a caution and a beacon. It warns us of the horrors that unchecked fanaticism can set loose. Yet it also inspires us with the incredible strength conviction can wield when directed with purpose. In the end, the massacre at Jerusalem remains one of the most extreme demonstrations in history of what a small, resolute band of men can accomplish. It captivates us because it embodies the very best and the very worst within human nature at once. Courage, loyalty, sacrifice stand side by side with savagery, cruelty, and devastation. It forces us to wrestle with a question that has no simple answer: was their devotion noble or monstrous? That judgment rests with each of us individually. What cannot be disputed is that their actions were extraordinary. It was a moment in time when the world discovered that faith had the power to move more than just mountains. It could drive armies, it could reshape the flow of history itself. And so, as this tale of blood and fire draws to its close, I urge you to reflect on the lesson at its heart. A small, unwavering circle of believers shifted the fate of thousands and redirected the course of nations. Their conviction transformed what seemed impossible into reality.